Verses 29 to 30 is a famous sort of series of things that God is doing on our behalf. God's foreknowing, He's predestining, He's calling, He's justifying, He's glorifying. Here you have the series of 5 stages, as it were, in the way God is bringing His ultimate work of salvation to completion in our lives. There's been a lot of debate about the sequence and how we are to understand it. And so let me very, very carefully and very emphatically say right at the outset, there are different ways of viewing these matters. I'm aware of that. I'm happy to dialogue with people who hold slightly different views. But I'm obliged, I think, to tell you a little bit about my own view on this. First, at the beginning, those whom God foreknew, He predestined. The verb foreknow in secular Greek often means what we might expect the English equivalent to mean. God knows something ahead of time. He can look into the future and see what's going to come. But in biblical Greek, and in the Old Testament scriptures, equivalent Hebrew as well, the language of knowing ultimately talks about God's loving or entering into relationship with somebody. The Old Testament tells us, for instance, that Israel is the only nation in all the world that God has known. Now, clearly, God knew about all the nations of the world, but only with Israel did He enter into a relationship. Granted this background in the language, and it is used this way also a couple of times in the New Testament elsewhere, and granted the fact that it's human beings that God foreknows here, I think that's the sense of the verb here. Those whom God sets on the road to ultimate salvation are those whom He has decided to enter into a relationship with beforehand. He, in His love, takes the initiative in calling, electing, and choosing people to be His own. And once He has taken that initiative, yes, He then predestines, He calls, He justifies, He glorifies. In other words, I'm taking what has been traditionally called a rather Calvinist understanding of the way election works. And of course, we're going to see Paul working this out in more detail in chapter 9 in just a moment. But I think that's what he's touching on here, giving us assurance as believers because God is the one who initiates and completes the process. He foreknows, He ultimately glorifies.